They sent 2 deputies and an HOA rep to my farm with a clipboard, an eviction notice, and smug grins on their faces. I didn't flinch, but they should have. Because the woman standing behind me, calm and quiet, had once cleared enemy compounds with nothing but a combat knife and night vision goggles. My wife may look like the average farm girl now, but she's a retired Navy SEAL. And when the HOA tried to force us off our own land, they stepped right into a mission they weren't ready for. It started with a letter that looked more like a generic ad than anything official. No seal, no county header, just a bland white envelope with a typed return address. Community Compliance Division. We almost tossed it into the junk pile. But inside was a letter claiming our red barn, the one that had stood on this property since my grandfather's time, was classified as a non-compliant auxiliary structure under newly enacted HOA regulations. We laughed it off. I mean, we don't even live inside the HOA boundary. Our farm is situated on a private tract just outside the community limits. My wife raised an eyebrow, read it twice, and muttered, "Must be a mix-up." That's what we thought it was, a bureaucratic glitch, nothing more. But then another notice came. This time, it was certified mail. It referenced the same issue, but now attached a $500 fine. When I called the number listed, the person on the other end sounded like they were reading from a script, insisting we had missed the annual compliance updates and that our property had recently been incorporated into the HOA jurisdiction per district expansion. That stopped us cold. Incorporated? By who? When? We sure hadn't signed anything, and we sure as hell hadn't agreed to be part of any HOA. My wife, always the researcher, started digging into property lines and local zoning maps. Everything confirmed what we already knew. We were legally outside the HOA's reach. No annexation, no contracts, no easements. Still, the letters kept coming, each one more aggressive than the last. By the end of the month, we had 5 different notices. One demanding that we repaint the barn to a color consistent with the community palette, another stating that our livestock fencing obstructed community visibility lines, a third requiring we register all animals for noise regulation compliance. That last one pushed me over the edge. Registering animals? On a farm? I attended the next HOA meeting just to get answers, but they didn't even let me into the main hall. A smug woman with a clipboard told me, "Sir, if you're non-compliant, you're not permitted to speak during board sessions. You'll need to submit all questions in writing through the compliance portal." Compliance portal. What a joke. We ignored the next few letters, figuring it would fizzle out. But they didn't stop. They doubled down. Soon after, we got our first real warning. A notice marked in bold red ink. Final notice: failure to comply may result in enforced removal under Section 14A. Now, they weren't just fining us. They were threatening to kick us off our own land. That's when my wife stopped laughing. She didn't say much, just started making calls. To the county office, to a zoning attorney, to a few friends she knew from her military days who had experience with land disputes. She pulled up every permit ever filed on our property, tracked every HOA boundary change in the past 10 years, and printed it all out on our kitchen table. What we discovered was chilling. The HOA had filed a false boundary adjustment with the county clerk's office 2 years prior, quietly expanding their coverage to include 4 private farms that had never agreed to be part of any association. The paperwork looked legitimate at first glance, but buried in the fine print was a forged authorization letter, signed with my name. They had literally faked my signature to claim jurisdiction over my land. I felt my stomach twist. This wasn't just a mistake. This was calculated. My wife looked at me calmly and said, "They're building a legal noose around our neck. We either stop them now or we'll be fighting eviction by next season." I still remember standing on our front porch that night, looking out over the pasture as dusk rolled in. I'd always thought the biggest threat to this farm would be a drought, or a busted well, or a bad market year. But now it was a group of entitled neighbors with clipboards, lies, and a network of influence. They thought we'd roll over, that we were just two rural folks with no power or pull. What they didn't know was that they'd just challenged a woman trained for war who saw their games for what they were and who had absolutely no intention of backing down. And from that moment on, we decided this wasn't going to be a quiet fight. If they wanted a war over this land, we'd give them one they'd never forget. The first thing that tipped us off that something wasn't right that morning wasn't the truck. It was the silence. Normally, our mornings start with the rhythmic clatter of the chickens, the low murmur of cattle in the pasture, and the wind slicing through the open fields. But that morning, it was quiet. Too quiet. I stepped outside and saw 3 men walking along the fence line near the back end of the property, clipboards in hand, one of them pausing every few feet to snap a picture. They weren't in uniforms, just plain blue polos with what looked like tiny embroidered HOA logos on the chest. One of them had a measuring wheel. Another was holding up a phone and recording. The third was marking something on our ground with bright orange spray paint. I walked straight over. "You guys lost or something?" I asked, trying to keep it civil. The oldest one looked up and, without even blinking, said, "We're here on behalf of the HOA Property Assessment and Boundary Inspection. Should have received a notice." I hadn't. Neither had my wife. And the thing is, even if we had, we weren't HOA. We never signed into any association, never agreed to be part of their rules or regulations. We were a private ranch, independently owned, and had been that way for generations. When I pressed them for credentials, they hesitated. One flashed a flimsy laminated badge that said HOA Compliance Coordinator. No county seal, no state licensing, just a name and a title printed in Comic Sans, like a kid's science fair project. "You don't have jurisdiction here," I said, narrowing my eyes. "This is private land. You're trespassing." Instead of backing off, the guy with the measuring wheel said, "That's not what our paperwork says." That set off alarm bells. I called my wife from the barn, and she showed up in minutes, holding a folder already thick with documentation. She didn't say much, just watched them. She has that trained Navy look, the kind that makes people feel like they've already made a mistake. The men finished up quickly and left, but not before planting 2 small red survey flags in our soil like they had staked some claim. That same night, my wife went full investigator mode. She scanned every document we'd received over the past month, cross-referenced addresses, and then logged into the county land management system. It didn't take her long to uncover the fraud. Someone had submitted a boundary expansion report claiming our property, and 2 others along the rural edge had agreed to enter into HOA jurisdiction. Attached was a digital signature under my name, dated 6 months earlier. I had never signed anything. The kicker? The digital signature had been processed through a third-party document site with 0 verification. No ID check, no confirmation call, no physical meeting. It was basically the equivalent of a forged email attachment, and yet somehow it had made its way into county records, logged and tagged as if it were legitimate. They had literally redrawn HOA boundaries, on paper, without landowner consent. And the kicker? No one at the county office had double-checked because, according to their files, everything looked clean. This wasn't an overstep. It was premeditated. My wife cross-checked the survey markers the men had left behind with the property lines in the forged documents. They weren't just surveying, they were creating a fake trail, a visual justification for their fabricated paperwork. Once enough photos were taken, and if we didn't fight back, they could eventually present those records to justify enforcement action. That's when the plan became clear. They were trying to push us into a corner where they could legally evict us from our own farm under the guise of non-compliance. Not because they had any right, but because they knew most people wouldn't know how to fight back. Unfortunately for them, we were not most people. My wife printed every document, highlighted the discrepancies, and started building what she called a war file. It included screenshots, timestamps, boundary maps, and affidavits from neighboring property owners. One of those neighbors? A retired real estate attorney who, after hearing our story, offered to help us pro bono. The next morning, we had surveillance cameras up, not just around the barn and the house, but across every fence line. I even installed motion-activated floodlights near the entrance just in case they tried to come back under the cover of night. What we didn't know yet, but were about to find out, was that this was just phase 1 of their scheme. They'd tried the paperwork. They'd tried the fake inspections. Next, they were coming with deputies, and that's where they'd make their biggest mistake. It was a Thursday morning when everything came to a head. I was out feeding the cattle when I heard the distinct crunch of tires on gravel, a heavier, slower sound than usual. Not the mailman, not the neighbor. I turned and saw a sleek black SUV making its way up our long dirt driveway. Behind it, a second vehicle, this one marked, pulled in quietly, unhurried like they had all day. County Sheriff's Department. And walking up right behind the two vehicles was a man in business casual attire, holding a clipboard like it was a sword. I wiped my hands and walked toward the house. My wife had already stepped out onto the porch, eyes narrowed, posture relaxed, but alert. Two deputies stepped out of the SUV. One of them looked fresh out of academy, nervous eyes darting from the barn to the house to the fields, like he knew something was off. The other was older, the kind who thought he'd seen everything. The HOA rep walked up behind them, holding papers like he'd just walked off a movie set. "I'm here to serve notice of eviction," he said, without even introducing himself. "Eviction?" I repeated. "You mean from the land we own?" The man glanced at the paperwork, didn't answer. The older deputy cleared his throat. "Sir, we were called to enforce a civil order filed by the Willow Creek HOA citing non-compliance with association bylaws. We need you to vacate the property within 48 hours. My wife stepped off the porch, calm as ever, her boots clicking softly against the wood. She stopped about 6 feet from the group and looked each of them in the eye. Then she asked, simply and clearly, "Do you have a signed court-issued eviction warrant?" There was a pause. "Well, the HOA filed," the clipboard guy began. "No," she interrupted. "Not what I asked. I asked if you have a court-issued eviction warrant, signed by a judge, with a docket number, filed properly through the county clerk." The older deputy looked at his partner. The younger one shook his head. She took a step closer. "Then you're trespassing," she said, voice firm but steady. "And if you take one step onto my porch with that clipboard again, I'll file criminal trespass charges against all 3 of you." The HOA rep stammered. "Ma'am, the association doesn't have jurisdiction here," she cut in. "And they don't get to fake court orders and expect law enforcement to back them up." The older deputy started getting defensive, hand casually resting near his belt. "Ma'am, we're just following up on a civil complaint." "Which isn't a legal eviction," she said. "Civil doesn't mean enforceable without a court order. You've got 5 seconds to leave this property or I start recording and then I call the county sheriff myself. And believe me, he'll be real interested to know his deputies got duped into acting as private enforcers for a rogue HOA." She didn't raise her voice once, but I saw the color drain from the clipboard guy's face. He knew. He'd tried to bluff his way into pushing us off our own land using intimidation and fake authority, hoping we'd cave and pack up. Instead, we called his bluff. The deputies hesitated. The younger one already looked like he regretted stepping out of the car. The older one cleared his throat again. "We'll check back with the sheriff's office," he mumbled. "This might be above our pay grade." They left without another word. The HOA rep lingered for a moment, then turned without saying anything and followed. My wife didn't move until both vehicles disappeared past the main road. When she turned to me, I just shook my head. "What just happened?" She walked past me calmly. "They thought we were civilians." I couldn't help but smile. She didn't mean that as a jab. She meant it as a reminder. We weren't amateurs. We weren't going to get bullied by a clipboard and a badge made in Photoshop. By lunchtime, she had already filed an incident report with the county sheriff, including names, badge numbers, and the time of day they arrived. She also sent a complaint to the state attorney general's office outlining how a civil organization had attempted to impersonate a legal authority in an effort to force landowners off their private property. But she wasn't done. That night, she contacted 2 investigative journalists we'd worked with before on veterans' land rights stories. She handed them everything: the forged digital records, the fake boundary claims, the unlawful presence of HOA board members on private property, and now the attempted eviction with no legal standing. What they'd tried was not just unethical, it was criminal, and we were going to make sure the entire state knew it. You see, my wife doesn't need to raise her voice to dominate a room. She doesn't have to flex muscle or flash a badge. She never brags, not even a whisper of what she's done or seen. But behind that quiet gaze and measured breath is a storm that very few can withstand. 12 years in Navy special warfare changed her, not into someone colder, harder, or distant, but into someone surgical, someone precise, someone who doesn't act until she's mapped every possible outcome and loaded every move with intention. And while the HOA tried to play homeowner politics, my wife was preparing for something else entirely, a counter-offensive. By the time that fake eviction stunt happened, she had already started tracing the paper trail. The HOA hadn't just accidentally filed fraudulent documents, they had filed multiple ones, altered meeting minutes, backdated approvals for activities they never voted on. Even the vote that authorized the takeover of the community's edge properties, which included our farm, was riddled with inconsistencies. They assumed no one would dig that deep. They assumed people like us wouldn't know how to spot military-grade deception. But my wife had built entire operations overseas based on less intel than what she pulled from the HOA's poorly secured Google Drive. What's worse, some of the HOA board members had deep financial incentives. 2 of them were sitting on shares in a construction firm that had been quietly maneuvering for rights to redevelop the entire surrounding area. And guess whose land was right in the middle of it? Ours. She didn't just find the threads, she pulled them until the entire scheme began to unravel. But she didn't stop there. She started logging everything: timestamps, emails, phone calls, and even footage from our property's perimeter cams. One of the HOA members had crossed the boundary fence weeks ago and placed what looked like a soil testing kit. That was trespassing, but more than that, it proved they had interest in what was beneath our land. They weren't just targeting us to be difficult. They were targeting us because they thought something valuable was here. And that changed the game completely. That night, she sat at the kitchen table for hours, contacting old friends from her Navy days. Lawyers, analysts, even a cybersecurity consultant. Within 48 hours, she had secured a chain of custody on every piece of evidence and passed it along to state officials and an investigative task force that specialized in HOA corruption. She told me flatly, "This isn't just about us anymore. These people have been playing God with other families' homes for years, and no one's called them out." I asked her how far she was willing to take it. She just looked at me and said, "All the way." Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't tremble. She was already 3 steps ahead. I remember watching her put together the entire case file like it was an op briefing, color-coded, labeled, cross-referenced. That wasn't just a binder of documents. That was a blueprint for justice. And then she told me something that sent a chill down my spine. This HOA isn't just trying to evict us. They're staging a land grab, one family at a time, and we're the only ones who fought back. At that point, everything made sense. The bizarre notices, the random citations, the fake towing attempt, the unauthorized drone flying over our fields 2 weeks prior. They weren't trying to enforce rules, they were running us off our land. But they didn't count on my wife being a Navy SEAL. They didn't count on her being trained in how to detect, dismantle, and destroy covert operations, especially ones poorly disguised as suburban bureaucracy. So while the HOA president was busy preparing the next compliance sweep, my wife had already submitted affidavits, filed formal charges with the county clerk, and shared the HOA's entire internal network with a local news station hungry for a corruption scandal. And the wildest part? She was calm through it all. Like she had done this before. Like every play they made only confirmed what she already suspected. Like she was baiting them into going further, just to catch them red-handed. To them, she was just a quiet farmer's wife. But to me, she was a one-woman tactical unit, and she'd just declared war. The following weeks weren't just a legal fight, they were a full-on siege. And my wife? She didn't just show up to that war, she commanded it. First, we hit them with an emergency injunction. The sheriff's department, now fully aware they'd been manipulated with falsified eviction notices and forged compliance violations, withdrew their involvement immediately. The deputies who'd tried to force their way onto our land had no legal standing, because the request never went through official channels. In fact, the HOA president had submitted the request through a private connection and claimed it was an urgent matter of community safety. That lie alone triggered a full internal review at the sheriff's office. While they were dealing with the fallout, we started building our offense. My wife coordinated with a civil rights attorney, one who specialized in HOA abuse cases, and compiled everything into a brutal legal packet. Doctored documents, unauthorized surveillance, trespassing, fraud, harassment, you name it. She laid it all out with military precision and a paper trail so tight, even their own legal team couldn't explain half of it. Then came the hearing. The courtroom was packed, not just with lawyers, but with other landowners from surrounding areas who'd caught wind of our case. Turns out, this HOA had a pattern. They'd been systematically targeting rural properties that bordered potential development zones. They'd slap homeowners with absurd fees, fake citations, and then threaten foreclosure or eviction under the guise of community planning. Most folks didn't fight back. They'd get tired, they'd move, and just like that, the HOA would gobble up the land. But not this time. My wife stood before the county board and calmly laid out the entire operation. No drama, no yelling, just facts, verified documents, time-stamped photos, public records that contradicted the HOA's own statements. One by one, the lies unraveled in real time. And when the board asked why we thought this was happening, she dropped the bomb. The HOA has financial ties to a private development group. 2 board members hold investment shares, and if our farm was seized, that land value would skyrocket. This wasn't about community compliance, it was about greed. You could feel the shift in the room. Suddenly, we weren't just a case, we were a spotlight, and nobody wanted to be caught in it. The board moved quickly. Within days, the HOA's power to issue fines or send notices was frozen under investigation. The president was forced to step down. The 2 board members with investments in the development group, officially suspended and under review for conflict of interest and fraudulent misrepresentation. But we didn't stop there. My wife worked with the same investigative reporter she'd contacted earlier, and within a week, a feature aired on local news titled Homeowners or Hostages: The Hidden Power of Rogue HO. As our case was front and center, so were interviews from other victims who had stayed silent until now. The public backlash was instant. The county launched a task force into HOA overreach, starting with ours. Former members came forward anonymously, revealing years of intimidation tactics, behind-closed-doors votes, and misuse of funds. And thanks to my wife's thorough documentation, there was no way to bury the evidence this time. The best part? Remember that board member who kept pushing to evict us the hardest? Turns out he'd used HOA funds to finance his own private landscaping business, then overcharged residents through mandatory maintenance fees. The moment that broke, the entire house of cards collapsed. Lawsuits started flying. One homeowner filed a class action. Another went after them for fraud. And us? We pushed forward with our own case for harassment, emotional distress, and attempted property theft. And we weren't just seeking damages, we were demanding reform. By the end of the month, the county officially stripped the HOA of its enforcement powers until a new oversight system could be installed. An independent auditor was brought in, and every single fine, fee, or citation issued by the previous board was declared null and void until reviewed. We had gone from being victims of a shady land grab to catalysts for real change, and the neighborhood would never be the same. The best part? The gate they once tried to use to shut us out? It's gone. The board removed it after public pressure turned it into a symbol of their corruption. Funny how quickly things change when people stop being afraid. And the woman they underestimated, my wife, well, she became something of a legend around here. Quiet, calm, and lethal with a legal pad. They thought they could bully us off our land. But instead, they woke a Navy SEAL and turned our farm into ground zero for their downfall. By the time the final hearing wrapped up, our case had gone from a local nuisance to a full-scale cautionary tale. The HOA that once ruled the neighborhood like a shadow government had been publicly dismantled. Their reign of threats, fake fines, and illegal land seizures was over, and the people who had once feared them were now the ones demanding answers. Our land, still ours, untouched, and stronger than ever. The day the official notice came through confirming the HOA's forfeiture of enforcement rights, I was out in the field with my wife. We were restoring an old irrigation line they'd once claimed violated aesthetic standards. I looked up from the trench to see her walking toward me, letter in hand, that subtle, knowing smirk on her face. "They're done," she said, handing me the paper. "No more fines, no more threats, no more power." We stood there for a moment in silence, listening to the wind move through the fence line. That land, our land, felt different now. It felt free. The fallout from the investigation had ripple effects far beyond just our case. Other HOAs across the county were now under scrutiny, especially those operating in rural zones where oversight had been virtually non-existent. State lawmakers began drafting new legislation to place checks on how much power private associations could legally hold, and more importantly, how easily they could be manipulated by individuals with personal agendas. And the board members who'd gone after us? Their worlds were unraveling fast. The former HOA president, the one who spearheaded the eviction and fake compliance letters, resigned in disgrace after internal emails surfaced showing she'd deliberately targeted us because she believed military families are too combative for planned communities. That line alone became a headline in 3 separate outlets. Her career in real estate? Over. The developer she was quietly working with backed out of the land project completely after seeing the backlash. They released a public statement blaming the HOA's misrepresentation and vowing to work only with communities that value transparency and ethical conduct. Translation: they didn't want to get sued either. And those 2 deputies who came charging onto our land with clipboards and smug grins, both were placed on administrative leave pending review. Turns out, one of them had already received multiple complaints for overstepping in HOA disputes, but nothing had ever been done. Our case brought it all to light. But the biggest victory wasn't what we destroyed, it was what we built. Neighbors who'd barely spoken to each other started organizing, forming a new committee to ensure fair representation and financial transparency. My wife helped them draft a new charter, one that protected landowner rights, capped special assessments, and banned undisclosed developer influence outright. For the first time in years, people were smiling at each other again. Barbecues returned. Kids played in the open without parents fearing random violations. The gate that once symbolized exclusion, torn down and replaced with a simple wooden arch that read, "Welcome to Red Rock Ranch." Our home wasn't just a victory for us. It had become a symbol of what happens when people stand their ground. And my wife, what can I say? She never sought the spotlight, never raised her voice, never made a scene. But she fought with a level of precision and control that no HOA was prepared for. Her service had taken her to war zones, to diplomatic missions, to rescue operations across the globe. But this was her battle on home soil, and she won it with her head held high. The HOA tried to force us out, strip us of our rights, and make an example out of us. But in the end, it was they who were exposed, broken apart by the very system they once twisted in their favor. I still remember that first morning they showed up at our gate, thinking they were about to make us vanish. But what they didn't realize was that they were trespassing on the wrong battlefield. And when the dust settled, our fences still stood. Our animals roamed free. Our names were cleared. Because the moment they came after this land, they didn't just mess with a farmer. They declared war on a Navy SEAL's wife. And that's the last mistake they'll ever make. If you think HOAs are getting out of control, hit that like button and subscribe for more unbelievable real-life HOA takedowns. Drop a comment if you've ever been pushed too far by your own HOA, or if you've stood your ground and fought back. And remember, when they cross the line, you don't back down. You expose them. See you in the next story.